The intern smirked as hot coffee soaked through my white coat. "My husband runs this hospital," she snapped. "You're finished." I looked at her ring, calmly dialed my phone, and said, "Honey, your new wife just threw coffee all over me." The hallway went dead silent, because nobody knew I was still legally his wife. Hot coffee soaked through my white coat before I even registered I'd been hit. It burned first, then it stung, then it just felt cold and wrong, spreading across my chest like something spilled had somehow become something spilled on purpose. I looked down at the stain, dark, wide, already cooling against my skin, and then up at the woman who'd thrown it. She was smiling. "My husband is the CEO of this hospital," she said, chin lifted like she was reciting a line she'd practiced in a mirror. "You're finished." I looked at the ring on her finger. Then, very calmly, I picked up my phone. "Honey," I said, "you should come downstairs. Your new wife just threw coffee all over me." The hallway went dead silent, because nobody standing in that corridor, not the nurses, not the residents, not the woman smirking in front of me, knew that I was still, legally, his wife. "My name is Dr. Catherine Monroe. I've spent 16 years at Westbridge Memorial Hospital, most of them in the cardiology department, the last 4 as director. I've delivered bad news to more families than I can count, and learned, a long time ago, that the worst days of other people's lives rarely announce themselves with drama. They usually just arrive quietly, on a Tuesday, while you're holding a coffee you don't have time to drink. That morning was supposed to be one of the boring ones. Sore feet from a double shift, a patient file tucked under one arm, 3 quiet minutes with a cup of coffee before rounds. I was crossing the main hallway on the 3rd floor when I ran into Madison Hale, 24 years old, 3 weeks into her internship, the kind of perfect hair and expensive heels that made you wonder how she'd found time to study for boards. She had already, in those 3 weeks, humiliated 2 residents in front of attending physicians and thrown a nurse under the bus for a scheduling mistake that was, according to everyone who'd actually seen the schedule, entirely Madison's own error. "You're standing in my way," she snapped when our shoulders nearly brushed. "Excuse me? Some of us are actually important here." I watched 2 nurses at the station behind her go very still, the particular stillness of people who've learned not to get involved. "Dr. Hale," I said, keeping my voice level, "respect isn't optional here. Not for me, not for anyone on this floor." Her face tightened in a way I'd come to recognize over 16 years of managing junior staff, the look of someone who's never once been told no and doesn't know what to do with the sensation. "Do you know who my husband is?" I didn't get a chance to answer. She grabbed the coffee out of my hand and threw it at my chest. That's the part I keep coming back to, replaying it, not the burn. The certainty on her face while she did it, like she already knew with total confidence that there would be no consequence for what came next. "My husband is the CEO of this hospital," Madison said, once the coffee had already done its damage. "1 call and you're gone by lunch." Nobody moved. I looked at the stain spreading across my chest, dark against the white coat I'd worn to this hospital for 16 years. Then I looked at her smug, satisfied little smile. The smile of a woman who'd never once had to clean up after her own mess because someone else always did it first. I pulled out my phone. "David," I said, calm and steady, the way I talk to a family in a consultation room right before I tell them something that's going to change their lives, "come down to the main corridor. Your new wife just threw coffee all over me." Madison's smile vanished. "And considering our divorce was never finalized," I added, loud enough for the whole hallway to hear, "I think we have a serious problem." You could hear the elevator doors open on the far end of the building. That's how quiet it got. Madison went white, then red. "You're lying." I wish I were. I wasn't lying. And to understand why I wasn't, you need to go back 3 months. To the night my husband of 22 years sat across from me at our kitchen table and told me he wanted space. 22 years. 2 miscarriages that nearly broke us both in different, quieter ways. 1 failed adoption that we never fully talked about afterward, because talking about it meant admitting how much it had hurt. He looked at me that night, across a table we'd eaten 10,000 meals at, and said he felt trapped by responsibility. I remember the specific stupidity of thinking, in that moment, that he meant the mortgage. I never signed the papers he sent over. My attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Renata Ford, who'd handled 2 decades of the hospital's own malpractice work before going independent, found holes in his financial disclosures, inconsistencies in the joint investment accounts, a life insurance policy whose beneficiary had quietly changed 8 months before he ever mentioned wanting space. I told myself at the time that he was hiding money, preparing to lowball me in a settlement. I was angry about it, but it made a kind of sense I could live with. I never once guessed he was hiding a whole other wife. Here's the thing about a 22-year marriage. You build a kind of architecture of trust so slowly you never notice it happening, beam by beam, until one day you realize you've been living inside a structure that was never actually load-bearing. The early signs, looking back, were there. David had started working later, which I told myself was normal for a hospital CEO managing a merger with 2 regional clinics. He'd started taking calls in his study with the door shut, which I told myself was board business, confidential the way executive matters often are. He'd stopped wearing his wedding ring for infection control reasons, which, in a hospital, is actually a real policy, and so I let that one go without a second thought, the way you let go of things that have a built-in cover story. I found out about the venue first, oddly enough, a receipt from a boutique event space in Georgetown, $1,400, tucked into a folder of expenses I'd been asked to help him organize for his accountant. I told myself it was a corporate gala. Hospitals throw those constantly, constantly. Fundraisers for new wings, galas for donor recognition. I didn't ask. 3 weeks later, I found the second thing, a jeweler's insurance appraisal for a ring I didn't recognize, filed under our joint umbrella policy, $38,000. I told myself it was a gift for someone, a daughter of a colleague, a graduation, something explainable. I didn't ask that time either. My hands were shaking when I closed the folder, but I told myself the shaking was about something else. I confronted him once, in April, holding both documents. He didn't deny anything with any real effort. He just said, in the exhausted, clipped tone he used on difficult board members, that I was reading too much into paperwork, and that we could discuss it when things calmed down at work. Things never calmed down at work. I understand now why. What I didn't know, what none of us in that hallway knew until Madison Hale threw a cup of coffee at my chest and forced the whole quiet architecture to collapse at once, was that David had married her in a private ceremony in May, 4 months into what he'd told me was a trial separation, while our divorce sat unsigned and unfinalized in a filing cabinet at Renata Ford's office 2 miles from the hospital, where he still, technically, employed me. Madison leaned in close enough that I could smell her perfume under the coffee stain now cooling against my own skin. "You're just a bitter old woman trying to embarrass me," she said. A nurse, Linda Ferris, 23 years at Westbridge, the kind of nurse who'd trained half the residents currently standing frozen in that hallway, stepped between us. "Dr. Hale, back up. You're fired too," Madison snapped at her, without even looking away from me. The elevator opened again. This time it was David. He walked out in a charcoal suit, already annoyed at being pulled from wherever he'd been, until he saw me, the coffee. The staff gathered in a loose, frozen half circle around us. Madison standing beside me, wearing a diamond ring I recognized instantly, because I'd worn it myself for 11 years before David asked for it back, to have it cleaned, and never returned it. My grandmother's ring. "Catherine, did you give her my grandmother's ring?" Madison looked down at her own hand like she was seeing it for the first time. David said his first wife was dead to him. Gasps rippled through the hallway. Actual audible gasps. The kind you'd expect from a daytime drama and not a hospital corridor at 8:40 in the morning. David closed his eyes. The exact expression of a man trying to hold up a collapsing wall with his bare hands and already knowing it isn't going to work. "Everyone, back to work," he said, in the voice he used for board meetings. "No," I said. "Not this time. Catherine, we can talk about this privately." "We are past private." Madison grabbed his arm. "Tell her I'm your wife." He said nothing. That silence said everything a hallway full of nurses and residents needed to hear. Madison's grip on his arm loosened. She looked at him, waiting for him to fix it, to say something, anything at all. He didn't. I watched 22 years of watching this exact expression on his face, the one he wore right before delivering news he'd already decided not to soften, settle over him now, aimed at someone else for the first time. A resident near the nurses' station lowered her clipboard, watching. 2 more staff members drifted closer, phones half raised, like they already sensed this was a story worth remembering, worth having proof of. David finally spoke, his voice flat. "Catherine, this isn't the place. You made it the place," I said. "The moment you let her throw coffee on me in front of your entire staff." He had nothing to say to that either. I unlocked my phone and held up the message thread from Renata Ford, still open from that morning. A reminder about the pending court date. The language unambiguous. Divorce never finalized. Case still active on the docket. Legally, standing in that hallway, I was still his wife. Then Linda stepped forward with her own phone out, thumb already scrolling to something she'd clearly been saving. "She's threatened staff for weeks," Linda said, nodding at Madison. "This morning, she changed a patient's medication order without an attending's approval. I reported it through the incident system myself at 6:52 a.m. The complaint disappeared from the log by 7:30. David's face went hard. Not at Madison, at Linda. That's the moment I understood what I was actually looking at. This wasn't just a hidden marriage, a secret ring, a humiliating scene in a hospital corridor. He'd been covering for her inside his own hospital, burying complaints, erasing incident reports, protecting the woman wearing my grandmother's ring, while actual patients paid the price for her mistakes. I looked at my husband, standing between the woman he'd married in secret and the wife he'd never legally divorced, and I said the only thing left to say. "David, you have exactly 1 hour before I call the board myself. I want to tell you I felt triumphant in that moment. I didn't. I felt sick, mostly. The specific hollowed-out nausea of realizing that a marriage you'd spent 2 decades defending, even to yourself, had been quietly gutted from the inside for months while you kept dusting the furniture. I went to the physician's lounge to change out of the ruined coat. My hands wouldn't stop shaking while I unbuttoned it, not from the burn, which had already faded to a dull ache, but from the sheer scale of what I now understood I was standing inside of. Renata Ford picked up on the first ring when I called her from the lounge. "He's married someone else," I said. "There's a ring, there's a wedding, there's an incident report that got deleted." There was a pause on the line, the specific pause of a lawyer recalculating an entire case in real time. "Catherine," she said finally, "I need you to write down everything right now while it's fresh. Names, times, exact words if you can remember them, and I need the name of that nurse. Linda Ferris. Get her number. If there's a pattern of suppressed incident reports, that's not just a marital problem anymore. That's a patient safety problem, and it puts the hospital's own liability in play, which changes everything about how fast this moves." I sat in that lounge for 20 minutes writing a timeline on the back of a patient education pamphlet because it was the only paper within reach, every detail I could could remember: the receipt, the appraisal, the date David had asked for the ring back to have it cleaned. I didn't cry once while I wrote it. I think I was too busy being furious to have room left over for grief. By the time I walked back out into the hallway, word had already spread through the hospital the way word does, not through any official channel, but through the informal network of nurses and residents who'd all, apparently, been quietly documenting Madison Hale's behavior for weeks and simply hadn't known who to trust with it. 3 separate staff members approached me that morning, unprompted, each with their own version of the same story: a deleted complaint, a dismissed concern, a patient chart altered without proper sign-off. None of them had gone to David directly. All of them, it turned out, had assumed, reasonably, given who Madison had married, that going to David would be the same as going to no one at all. At 11:15 that morning, I was called into a conference room on the 4th floor, the one with the long oval table and the framed photograph of the hospital's original 1962 groundbreaking on the wall. Waiting for me were 3 people I hadn't expected, all in the same room at once. Dr. Ansel Whitcomb, Chief of Medical Staff, 29 years at Westbridge, a man I'd worked alongside since my 2nd year of residency. Beside him sat Priyanka Rao, Director of Compliance, a woman known throughout the hospital for a reputation of taking exactly 0 shortcuts, ever, on anything. And at the head of the table, unexpected and unwelcome, sat 2 members of the hospital's board, people David had personally recruited 5 years earlier, back when he still had the political capital to handpick his own oversight. Dr. Monroe, Priyanka said, "We understand there was an incident this morning." "There were several," I said. "I'd like to start with the ones involving patient safety, since I imagine those matter more to this room than my marriage does." Something flickered across Dr. Whitcomb's face. Respect, maybe, or relief that I wasn't going to make this only about the coffee. Over the next 40 minutes, Priyanka walked the room through what her team had already begun pulling together, faster than I'd expected. The deleted incident report Linda had flagged, time-stamped, and recoverable from the hospital's own backup logs, even after someone had removed it from the active queue. A second altered chart, discovered by a pharmacist named Robert Chen, who'd noticed a dosage discrepancy that didn't match any physician's actual order. A pattern, going back 6 weeks, of complaints against Madison Hale that had been logged and then, within hours, quietly closed by an administrator account with credentials that traced back to David's own executive login. "He closed the complaints himself," I said. It wasn't a question. "We're still confirming the full extent of it," Priyanka said carefully. "But the login trail is consistent with that, yes." Dr. Whitcomb leaned forward. "Catherine, I want to be direct with you. This is no longer a personnel matter between you and David. If a CEO used his own credentials to suppress patient safety complaints in order to protect his wife's," he paused, choosing the word carefully, "his second wife's employment record, that's a governance failure the board has to answer for, publicly, regardless of what happens between you two privately." One of the board members, a retired judge named Harriet Voss, who'd sat on Westbridge's board for 11 years, spoke for the first time. "Dr. Monroe, are you prepared to formally document what you witnessed this morning and what you've since learned about the marital status discrepancy?" "I've already started," I said, and slid the pamphlet with my handwritten timeline across the table, along with a printout of the thread from Renata Ford confirming the divorce had never been finalized. Judge Voss studied it for a long moment. "Then I think," she said, "this board has some very uncomfortable questions to ask Mr. Monroe." I'd given David 1 hour in that hallway. He used most of it trying to reach me by phone, which I let ring through 6 times before Renata advised me, gently, to stop answering entirely and let the process do what it needed to do. At 12:40, an email went out to the entire medical staff distribution list. Not from me, not from Priyanka, but from the board's communications office, informing staff that David Monroe had been placed on immediate administrative leave pending an internal governance review, effective that afternoon. I heard secondhand that Madison was escorted from the building by hospital security shortly after 1 p.m., her internship suspended pending a separate review by the Graduate Medical Education Committee. I wasn't there for that part. I didn't need to be. What I was there for, at 2 p.m., was a meeting in Renata Ford's office, where she laid out, in the calm, methodical way she'd laid out every difficult conversation of the past 3 months, exactly what my legal position now was. "The marriage to Madison Hale isn't valid," she said. "You and David are still legally married under Virginia law, which means any ceremony he participated in with her constitutes bigamy, a criminal offense, not just a civil embarrassment. That's separate from, but related to, everything Priyanka's team is uncovering about the suppressed complaints." "What does that mean for the divorce?" "It means," Renata said, "that when this finally does finalize, and it will, you're not walking into that negotiation as a spurned wife hoping for a fair split. You're walking in as the only legal spouse of a hospital CEO, currently under a governance investigation for using his executive credentials to bury patient safety complaints. That changes every number on the table, Catherine. Every single one." I sat in her office a long time after that, looking out the window at the parking garage across the street, thinking about the wedding I'd apparently missed, the ring I'd worn for 11 years before it ended up on someone else's hand, and the strange, cold clarity that comes after a shock finally settles into something you can actually use. The governance review took 6 weeks. I wasn't part of the investigative team, obviously, but Priyanka kept me informed as far as protocol allowed, and Dr. Whitcomb, who'd known David nearly as long as I had, made a point of telling me things in person, person, rather than letting me read them cold in a memo. The final report, presented to the full board in a closed session I was asked to attend as a witness, confirmed what the informal hallway network had already suspected for weeks. David had personally closed 11 separate incident reports involving Madison Hale over a 4-month period, using his own administrative login rather than routing them through the normal review chain, a direct violation of hospital bylaws, and, per Judge Voss's own reading of the relevant statute, potentially, actionable as obstruction, given that at least 2 of the suppressed complaints involved documented medication errors that reached actual patients. The board voted 7-1 to terminate David's employment for cause. The one dissenting vote, I was told, came from a board member who argued only that the termination should have happened faster. Madison's internship was formally revoked by the Graduate Medical Education Committee. Her state licensing board opened its own inquiry, separate from the hospital's, into the falsified medication order Linda had originally flagged. I don't know, as of this writing, how that inquiry has resolved. I've made a point of not checking. David was charged 3 weeks after his termination with a single count of bigamy under Virginia Code, a charge Renata told me carries real, if modest, criminal penalties, but whose greater damage in David's case was reputational. The story moved fast once it left the hospital. A local news outlet ran it first. A national one picked it up 2 days later, and by the end of that week, David Monroe's name had become, in certain circles, a punchline attached to a headline about a coffee cup and a wedding ring. People ask me sometimes now whether I regret picking up the phone that morning instead of just walking away to change my coat and let the whole thing blow past me. I don't. I think about Linda Ferris more than I think about David, honestly. About how long she must have sat on that deleted incident report, unsure whether reporting it again would cost her a job she'd held for 23 years. I think about the resident who lowered her clipboard and started recording because some instinct told her this moment mattered before any of us had the full picture. I think about how many complaints, how many altered charts might have kept disappearing quietly if a woman I barely knew hadn't walked up to me in a hallway 3 weeks into her internship and decided I was beneath her notice. The divorce finalized 4 months after the incident. I got my grandmother's ring back, not from Madison, who'd surrendered it as part of the hospital's internal settlement once it became clear it had never legally been hers to keep, but from Renata's office, mailed to me in a small padded envelope I didn't open for 2 days because I wasn't ready yet. I still work at Westbridge. Dr. Whitcomb asked me, 6 weeks after David's termination, whether I'd consider stepping into an interim leadership role while the board conducted its search for a permanent CEO. I said yes, mostly because Linda Ferris asked me to, in the quiet, direct way she asks for things that actually matter.